Okay, lesson 12.4, we're going to do completing the square. Okay, in chapter 9, we talked about the quadratic equation, or the quadratic equation, and then how to solve a quadratic equation. All right, we used the formula x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. We did all of that whenever I had an equation that looked like this. X squared plus bx plus c, and it normally equaled 0. Okay? Now we did this equation right here so that we could solve for x, because I knew I could not solve for x because these are not like terms. Okay? So what completing the square is it is just, I think, an easier way to solve for x. So instead of using the quadratic equation, we are just going to use completing the square. And again, I think it's easier, okay? This is the formula that you need to memorize. Now, this formula looks really hard and scary, but it's really not, okay? So go ahead and write this formula down. You do need to memorize it, but you'll figure out that it's not so much I need to memorize what the letters are, it's you need to memorize how to do it, and we'll get into that. This is the problem that we're going to use so I can show you how to do it in a second, but this is part of the formula. I want you to go ahead and write that down. Okay, so this is what you do when you are completing the square. First of all, the first thing that you have to know, whenever you are completing the square, x squared and x, the numbers that's going to be before x, always has to be on one side of the equation by itself. Okay, this is the number that we would call c because it doesn't have any variables, and that has to be on the other side. Okay, so no matter what, before I can do anything, the x squared and the x have to be by itself. So I notice in this problem, okay, it is by itself, so I can go ahead and I can start. This is exactly what you do. I'm going to write x squared plus 10x. Now, this is where this part of the equation comes into play. I look at b. b is always the number right here in front of 10, or front of x, I'm sorry. So I write plus, I'm going to write b, which is 10 in this case, divided by 2. It will always be divided by 2. That will never change. These numbers will change because your b will be different in almost every equation, but the divided by 2 will never change. And then I take that answer and I square it. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So I put 24 plus, and I just write the exact same thing. 10 divided by 2 squared. Okay? Now, this is all you do here. X squared plus 10x. What's 10 divided by 2? 5. So I have 5 squared. What's 5 squared? 25. So I'm going to erase this and just replace it with 25. Equals, whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other, and I just figured out 10 divided by 2 is 5. 5 squared is 25. So I always am just going to write whatever I write over here, I write over here. So plus 25. All right? This is all you got to do now. I've got to add these two numbers together. 24 plus 25 is 49. And this is exactly how you write this side of the equation. What I have to do is I have to factor this. And I'm going to tell you a very simple way to factor it. Okay? This is all you got to do. I write my parentheses. And no matter what, whatever we do in completing the square, it always is going to make it where it's going to be the exact same thing. When I factor it, it would be like x plus 2 times x plus 2, or x plus 4 times x plus 4, or whatever it is, it's going to be the exact same thing twice. So I just write my parentheses and squared. Now this is how you figure out what goes in parentheses. Everybody listening. It will always be the square root of that first term, which is what's the square root of x squared? X. The problems that I give you, it will always start out with x at the beginning. Always. It's never going to be anything different. I'm not going to give you any number in front of x squared. I'm not going to give you anything different. It will always be x. Now, I either have to have a plus or a minus sign, and this is how I figure out. I look at b. If b is plus, it's a plus sign. If b is a negative, it's a minus sign. So in this case, I need to put plus, and this is how I figure out the last terms. Everybody ready? I look at this last term right here, which is 25, and I ask myself, what's the square root of 25? 5. So that goes right here. So now I have a problem that I can solve. X plus 5 squared equals 49. Now, I've got to solve for x because that's the whole point of this. All right, so what you're going to do, remember what we learned yesterday? We did the square root of x, let's say, equals 49. What did I do to get x by itself? I squared it. Okay, so today, now, I have something that is squared. So how do you think I'm going to get it by itself? Square root it, exactly. So I square root this side. Whatever I do to one side, I've got to do the other. That cancels that out. And I'm left with x plus 5. Now this is the part you got to know. The square root of 49 is what?
7.
But it's not only positive 7, but also negative. I have to have positive, whoa, I don't know where, 79 came from, okay? Positive and negative 7. I have to have that sign. If I don't, my equation will be wrong because you will always have two answers, okay? And that positive negative sign is how you do. So now I just got to solve. Since I know that x plus 5 equals 7 and x plus 5 equals negative 7, that's how I write it. X plus 5 equals 7, and I'm going to write it right down here. X plus 5 equals negative 7. Just separate it into two problems. So now I subtract 5 here, and I get x equals 2. Subtract 5 on this one, and I get x equals negative 12. That's exactly what you do. All right, so let's do the next example. We're basically doing that exact same thing what I just did with these two problems, okay? You always want to check first before you do anything and make sure that x squared and x are by themselves on one side of the equation. So I check and I see that they are. 35 is on the other side, so I know I can proceed. I write x squared plus 2x. Then I put plus. This is the part where a lot of people get stuck because they go, what do I do next? Remember, you take b. What is b in this problem? 2. So I write 2, divide it by 2. It's always going to be divided by 2. Then that is going to be squared. Equals 35. Whatever I do to one side, I do the other. So I just write the exact same thing. 2 divided by 2 squared. Okay? What is 2 divided by 2? 1. What is 1 squared? 1. Whatever I add to one side, I got to add to the other, so I do 35 plus 1. Okay. Now what you're going to do is you're just going to add. 35 plus 1 is 36. And in order to write this next step, what I have on the left side of the equation, I do parentheses, and it's going to be squared because no matter what, I know that that's how it's going to be. What is my first term always in the parentheses? X. What does my sign have to be on this problem? Positive. And I know that because I look at this sign right here, and it's a positive. So I know it's got to be a plus. So I put plus, and then how I find the number is it's always going to be the square root of this number right here. What's the square root of 1? 1. Okay? Now, I've got to solve this. So what should I do now, Caitlin? Square root. Very good. I've got to get that x by itself, so I need to do the square root. Whatever I do to one side, I do to the other. What happens to that square root sign is that squared and the square root cancel each other out. That's where it goes. It doesn't just vanish. They cancel each other out. So now I'm left with x plus 1 equals, what is the square root of 36? Positive and negative 6. Very good. Remember, you have to have that sign. Now I can just break it into two problems and solve. I have x plus 1 equals 6, and x plus 1 equals negative 6. Okay, remember, it's the exact same equation, just one answer is positive, one answer is negative. Then I have to subtract 1, and I get x equals 5. And I subtract 1, and x equals negative 7. And those are my two answers. Okay? All right, let's do this next problem here. I'm going to go ahead and erase this work so I have plenty of room to do it. Okay, I've got to check. First of all, what do you have to check first? Exactly. I've got to see if x squared and x are by itself. Are they? Yes, they are. So I know I can move on. So I write x squared plus 16x. Then what do I have to write now? Parentheses. 16 over 2 squared. Very good. Then whatever I do to one side, I've got to do to the other. So 16 over 2 squared. What is 16 divided by 2? 8. What is 8 squared? 64. 4 plus 64. What's 4 plus 64? 68. How am I going to write this left side right here? What would I do? Parentheses. X plus 8, and then I have a squared. All right, Sydney, how did you get that 8 right there? The square root of 64. And how did you know that there was a plus sign there? Because B is positive. Very good. Now, what am I going to do so I can solve this, Jake? Square root sign, the radical sign. So I put the square root sign that cancels that out, and I'm left with x plus 8. Now, what happens over here? Do I have an exact square root of 68? No. But can I reduce the square root of 68? Yes, I can. I've got to do that. Now, you can either do upside down division, or if you have a calculator that will simplify it for you, just go ahead and plug it into the calculator and let it simplify it. Okay? That's probably the easiest way, the least amount of work. When I do that, I'm going to get 2 times the square root of 17. What does that 2 times the square root of 17 have to have? Positive and negative. Just because I don't have an exact square root does not mean I can leave off that positive and negative. No, it has to be there every single time. Now, this is what I've got to do. I need to subtract 8 because I know that 2 times the square root of 17, when I move 8 over there, they're not like terms. They're not going to be able to combine. So this is all I do. I subtract 8 on both sides, and I get x equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root of, 2 times the square root of 17. And I can leave my answer like this, because technically this represents 2 answers. Because I have negative 8 plus 2 times the square root of 17 and negative 8 minus 2 times the square root of 17. So that's what I want to do, because I know they're not like terms, so there's no point in me writing it out twice. I just leave the plus and minus sign there, and I know that represents 2 answers. Okay? Okay, and then the final example, what we're going to do is we're doing the exact same thing. What is that first question that is so important that you have to ask yourself? Is x squared and x by itself? Is it? No. What's over there with it? The negative 3. So I've got to move that negative 3 before I can do anything. So I add 3 to both sides. And I get x squared minus x equals 3. Now I can start my process. Okay? And I'm going to write x squared minus, what's that number in front of x? 1x. Then what's going to go in parentheses? 1 over 2 squared equals 3 plus 1 over 2 squared. Okay? Now look right here. I've got a fraction. I do not want to change it to a decimal. Does everybody hear that? Do not change it to a decimal. If you do, it will be wrong. All right. What's 1/2 squared?
2 and 1/2.
Nope.
1 and 1/3. 1 and 1/4. 1 and 2/4.
1/4. Okay. All right. This is what it is. Shh. This is what you do. This is all you do in order to square a fraction. I do the numerator squared and the denominator squared. So what's 1 squared? 1. What's 2 squared? 4. That's how I figured out. That's all you got to do. Square the numerator, square the denominator. Whatever I do to one side, I've got to do to the other. Now, I've got to add these two numbers together. Plug it in your calculator. You don't want to deal with a mixed number, so let's make it an improper fraction. What's 3 plus 1/4? 13 over 4. Exactly. You want to make it an improper fraction, okay? It's going to make it easier for you if you make it an improper fraction. Now, I've got to write this side over here. So I do my parentheses and squared. What's my first term? X. What is my sign going to be? Minus, because that 1 is a negative 1. Now I've got to find out, what's the square root of 1/4? We just figured it out because we had to square it to get 1/4. 1/2. Now, I've got to get the square root. So I do the square root, which cancels out. Square root. Whenever you do the square root of fractions, just like when you're squaring them, I've got to do the square root of the numerator and the square root of the denominator. So on this left side, I'm left with x minus 1/2 equals, what's the square root of 13? There is nothing, and I can't simplify it. What's the square root of 4? 2. Remember, there's never allowed to be a radical in the denominator. So the fact that that works out and I'm left with 2, a whole number, that's good. Okay? I'm not going to give you any where you will have them, but just remember, you cannot leave it the square root of 13 over 4. You've got to simplify. What is this missing that it needs to have? Positive and negative. So, I know since I can't combine these because they're not like terms, how would I write this? Or what do I need to do now? Add 1/2 first. And I get x equals 1/2 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 2. And that is my final answer right there. Okay? So that's how you deal with it when you have fractions. Remember, whenever you're trying to square a fraction, you square the numerator and the denominator. That's how we got 1 squared was 1, 2 squared was 4. Whenever you're taking the square root of a fraction, you square root the numerator and the denominator. The square root of 13 was the square root of 13, but the square root of 4 was 2. Okay, now let's do this last problem here. All right, what do I have to ask myself first?
Is x squared and bx on the side by itself?
Is it by itself? No, it's not. So what do I need to do? Subtract 2. I get x squared minus 8x equals negative 2. Now I can start my process. Okay, I've got x squared minus 8x. Then what needs to come next?
Plus
8 over 2 squared equals negative 2 plus 8 over 2 squared. So now I get x squared minus 8x plus, what's 8 divided by 2? 4. What's 4 squared? 16. Negative 2 plus 16. All right, I'm going to go over here. What am I going to have on that right-hand side? Negative 2 plus 16. I always like to do this side first so I know what it's going to equal. So I just go ahead and write the 14. Then I say, okay, how am I going to write this side? You can do it the left side first and then the right side. It doesn't matter. That's just how I do it. I write my parentheses and squared. Then what has to become the first? X. What's my sign? Minus 4. Very good, because I know it's the square root of 16. What do I do now, Stefan? Not add. I need to get rid of this. So how am I going to get rid of it? Square root. Very good. I got to do the opposite. Square root. I get x minus 4 equals the square root of 14. Can I simplify the square root of 14? No. And what does this square root of 14 have to have? Plus or minus. Very good. What should I do now? Add 4. I get x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 14. Okay? And that's how you do completing the square.